Great. So I'm glad everybody could join us. And I'm happy to introduce Justin Goldstein, who is with Sefaria. And Justin comes to us from Asheville, North Carolina. So thank you for staying up an extra hour beyond wherever it is for us. And I'll let you take it from here, Justin.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for turning out what I think is a really interesting, fascinating conversation about where this very ancient text is finding new ways of finding itself into people's hands and literally into people's pockets, and completely transforming the way that we access our ancestral wisdom and tradition. Just a few words about myself before some more in-depth words about Sefaria. I grew up not far from where all of you are, in the north suburbs of Chicago. And before joining Sefaria as our learning coordinator, was the co-founder of a Jewish farming project here in Western North Carolina, which I've parted ways from, but is still an active benefit to the world. And before that, served synagogues here in Western North Carolina and Asheville, and before that in Bangor, Maine, and did my rabbinical studies in Los Angeles, and have just been in absolute deep love with the texts of our ancestors and the wisdom of our tradition for my entire life. And it's such an honor and privilege to get to do this work with Sefaria. Before we dive into actually looking at this amazing website, I want to name, it's such a small group of us, please interrupt me. And I will be sharing my screen, so I won't necessarily be able to see all of your faces all the time. So if I'm going too fast or too slow, or if you have questions of any variety, please either just unmute yourself and let your question be known, or you can try and put something into the chat box. I generally always remind people, we all have questions, and you probably have a question that you want to ask that someone else also has, and that person might be too afraid or shy to ask that question. So you can ask that question so that they don't have to. But that every question will inspire a part of a conversation. And really, I want this to be a conversation about what does it mean to live in an age in which, again, these ancient texts are provided in a very new format, and that the power of this digital format allows for us to access these words in ways that until very recently was just not possible. How many of you are familiar with Sefaria, the website? Is that a term that you know? Yeah. Is it a website that you visited? So it seems like all of you, or most of you, it is do you remember, and you can unmute yourself to answer, do you remember when you were first shown Sefaria or told about this idea that there is this website that does something with all of these Jewish texts? Maybe you want to share what that was like.
About four years ago.
About 4 years ago.
We had somebody from Sefaria come.
To the
I just heard word of mouth.
To your synagogue.
Yeah.
Yes, through Temple Har Zion.
Excellent.
I think it was just word of mouth. Somebody said, I had all those Dafka CDs, the Talmud and all that, and then I had computers on which they didn't run anymore. So yeah, this was phenomenal to discover, but it's quite a few years ago.
Right. And so Sefaria is only 10 years old. And I've been using it for as long as it's been available to the public. And I have a hard time remembering how it is that we learned Torah before we had this amazing tool and resource. And yes, those Davka CDs, Davka was a company that was, I believe, on the early end of digitizing texts of the Jewish canon and providing them on CD-ROMs, later on different databases. And so, Cindy, thank you for bringing that up. And that I do want to name digital Torah, the idea of Torah stored digitally is not new. Sefaria did not invent it. And so what is it that has made Sefaria so exciting is not so much the innovation of storing Torah in digital format, but is in the technology that it allows to access those digital files. I'm sure some of you, or perhaps all of you, heard the news of the recent auction of the Codex Sassoon. People are familiar with this?
No.
So the Sassoon Codex, or the Codex Sassoon, is the oldest intact, complete Hebrew Bible manuscript. It is not the oldest manuscript. It is not the only intact or only complete, but it is, of all of those things, it is the oldest intact, complete Hebrew Bible, and Sotheby's just auctioned it off yesterday. And it was unknown where it would go and to whom it would be sold, but it was purchased by the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, formerly known as the Museum of the Diaspora. And I think the organization is that runs the museum is now called ANU. And a man named Alfred Moses, who was the former ambassador from the US to Romania, apparently put up the resources to, I think it was $38.1 million, so that this codex could be in this museum where it belongs. What is a codex? There are numerous codices of the Hebrew Bible. It's a book, right? It's just a fancy word for a book. But we have some famous codices in Jewish history. The Aleppo Codex is probably
right.
What is the Aleppo Codex?
Well,
as
it's
much or as little as you might know.
What is it? It has the vowels and the notations for chanting and you know, it was the earliest. I'm trying to think what is there's a word for it when it has the vowels and anyway, but I think that was formed around the 10th century or something like that. Yes,
I believe that dating is correct. David, is that accurate as far as you know? And my understanding is that it is the oldest codex that we have in possession. We're not certain that it is the oldest one that was produced, but it is the oldest that we have. Wow. It is not complete.
And now it's not complete because sections of it were spirited off. I mean, there's a whole story of that Bible. And,
fascinating story.
What happened to it, which is very interesting.
There's a particular, I don't know if it's a single page or a couple of sections of it were unknown to this family, kept within this Syrian Muslim family for years. And after Israel had collected it, someone realized that they had this as a family heirloom, but didn't know what it was, reunited it with the rest of the codex. It's truly a fascinating story. One of the fascinating parts of the story of the Aleppo Codex is that it was in the library of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam, or Maimonides.
Right.
So yes, it was the guide that scribes used to determine how to accurately write and read from a Torah. Those codices were then copied into various manuscripts and spread throughout the world so that scribes could reproduce accurate Torah scrolls. We still use text based on those codices. What Sefaria has in our possession, or what Davka had in their version of their CD-ROMs, any version of digitized Torah is, in essence, no different than, as a core piece of technology, no different than those codices. And so I bring this up because it can be so striking and shocking, both in a positive way of, oh my God, this educational resource is incredible. And it can be shocking in that, wow, are we really going to turn the Torah into an app? Right? And there is a certain sense of a disbelief that we have really come to the place that we are so integrating digital technology into our lives that it only makes sense that we access the Torah through an app. And that is not actually any different than any point in our history previous from the time that these texts were written down, how we have maintained them and preserved them for future generations to make the best use of. And that ultimately is what Sefaria is here to do in the world, is to provide access to Jewish texts in digital form so that more and more people can access the wisdom of the tradition for their own interests and needs. And it is revolutionary in the sense of how this technology can be leveraged to illuminate aspects of how Jewish canon tradition, of how Jewish textual tradition works. But in a very fundamental way, this is not revolutionary at all. It is just our 21st century version of the same thing that our ancestors have been doing. Any questions before I dive in?
So Justin, what about the Leningrad Codex, and how does that fit into that whole the codices?
Yeah, so there are, I think the most well-known ones are probably the Leningrad Codex, the Aleppo Codex, the Sassoon Codex. There are so many. There's a handful of ones that are in that survive. There are some that we know to have existed that we don't have in possession anymore. I don't believe that there are any significant textual differences between the Leningrad and the Aleppo Codex, perhaps some minor scribal differences, but by and large, they might have different margin notes and things like that. What makes the Aleppo Codex so important is that I believe it's thought to be a carbon copy of the original work of the Masoretes, who are thought to have vocalized the Torah and included the cantillation marks. Why the Leningrad Codex is specifically interesting, I believe, has to do with how well it was preserved more than any of its anomalies. But I really, this was stuff that I learned as an undergraduate student years ago, so I'm not equipped to answer those. But I think it's a fascinating, all of these codices have fascinating stories. Any other questions? Great.
Do you think that the sheer accessibility has a unique impact? So you said it's no different than the past, which completely agree in a sense, but there are two things that are unique now. One is anyone can, without any effort or money, scarcely, have access. And the other is the linking, the ready linking and comparison of an almost infinite number of, it feels it's almost infinite.
Yes.
But that feels qualitatively different.
Yes, and that's exactly what we're going to address is what makes this new way of accessing Torah help illuminate this old text. Doesn't change the text, but it can fundamentally change our relationship to it. And I think, and something that we'll speak a little bit more to, I think can, this type of technology allows for us to engage in a level of in-depth study that our tradition has always engaged in with these texts. Books just might not have been the best technology to do it. And now we are beginning to have speed of computing that allows for us to simply have more. Access is the word that you will hear me use a lot this evening.
Yes, in our tradition, but not for every member of the community.
No, and that's where the revolutionary aspect.
I mean, there are big classes of Jews.
Correct, and that's
they couldn't really.
Correct, and that's exactly what we will talk about.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes. So, again, I'm going to share my screen, so I won't be able to see folks quite as well, but we will do our best to manage. Okay. What we're looking at here is the homepage of Sefaria, and I like to point out that it has a very simple design. And the layout is in some sense designed to remind us of a library. We can imagine these different columns and sections with the different colored headers and the titles as stacks, as shelves in a library that you would figuratively walk through. Sefaria, like I mentioned, has been around for 10 years, and from its onset has been driven by a particular ideology of making Torah open in its access to everybody that wants to come across it. And what this means is that the materials that one finds in Sefaria's library are licensed to be used, not just licensed to be viewed, but licensed to be used. A majority of our texts, not 100% of our texts, but a majority of our texts are not just licensed to be used, but are licensed with the ability to use them commercially. So an internal conversation that we will often have philosophically and ideologically is the distinction between free like beer and free like speech. And many times you'll go to a website that offers free content, and it is free like beer in that you might have a friend who offers to buy you a beer, and that it's a gift that was given to you at someone else's expense. Free speech is a different kind of liberty. It's not free because someone gifted it to you in our political theory. It is free because it is inherent to your humanity. Sefaria's belief is that the Torah should be free inherently to every member of the Jewish community, however that individual may identify themselves or that community. By virtue of being on the internet and free, we have no control over who enters and accesses our site, and we are committed fully to ensuring that those texts are available to them. And so we use the language of the Jewish library being democratized. The access to the library is democratized. What each of us can, will, or might want to do with those texts is individualized, but the access is democratized. And so the understanding that what ultimately on a technological level Sefaria is engaged in is, again, storing the data of Torah for future generations, which, as I mentioned, is no different than what the scribes who created the codices that are Torah scrolls that you're watching here, this video sequence of a scribe writing these letters. Very much the act of storing Torah digitally is in this same line of how our ancestors stored these words. However, the ability to store them digitally allows for us to interact with them in a fundamentally different level. And so one of the things that Sefaria is most well equipped for is helping us find the connections that are inherent inside of our textual tradition. One of the things that makes Jewish learning so exciting and interesting and also deeply intimidating is because of the vast connections between texts. And so what we're looking at right now is a web of connections between verses in Tanakh, verses in the Hebrew Bible, and where they are quoted throughout the 70 volumes of the Talmud. And this might seem like an arbitrary tool. It also might seem like very beautiful artwork. But what this allows for us to do is to see ways that our ancestors, simply by virtue of not having the data stored in one place, could not have explored these connections to the same depth and to the same level. And so it allows for us to illuminate understandings of these connections and find patterns in the wisdom of our ancestors that previously would have taken simply too much time and human effort to be able to calculate. And so much like computing in general has made our lives in many ways more complicated, but in some fundamental ways, especially when it comes to how we use our time, a little bit easier, Sefaria has been designed not only to make it easier for us to access these texts, but to begin to explore more deeply how they come into connection with each other. Now, the Talmud is, perhaps not surprisingly, the most widely accessed text after the Bible, after the Torah, in Sefaria's library. I remember going to see Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz speak once at a synagogue in Los Angeles. For those who might not be familiar with the name, one of the most prolific and influential rabbis of the 20th century, who lived in Israel, I believe was born in Israel, very prominent in the world of Chabad, but his influence reached far outside of that community, and wrote many, many books on every aspect of Jewish life. And I was listening to him speak about the not full completion of his translation of the Talmud at that point, but his acknowledgement that he himself was no longer going to continue to translate, but that teams of people would do their best to finish the translation of the Talmud. And I remember Rabbi Steinsaltz saying at that lecture, as much as the Jewish people made the Talmud made the Jewish people. That this repository of legal discourse and disputation and debate and folklore has influenced our cultural sense of self through how we learn and how we value education and the types of questions that we ask and just how many questions that we ask. And so in these many texts that you find in Sefaria's library, again, the Talmud is one that is most visited. And so just a couple of words about how licensing works at Sefaria. Most of our texts, as I mentioned, are completely open licensed so that a person could take the material in our library, produce it into their own book or coursework or video or whatever item they wanted and sell that material and not have to pay Sefaria anything. An exception to this is what we call the William Davidson edition of the Talmud. William Davidson Talmud is not something that you can purchase in any Judaica store or on Amazon or anywhere else. You can only find it at Sefaria. And it's called the William Davidson Talmud because that's the name of the person of the foundation who funded it. The ability for Sefaria to license Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz's translation of the Talmud, which is the same translation that the Koren Publication Company publishes. So if you wanted to have a copy of the Steinsaltz translated Koren Talmud in your home, on your bookshelf, it would cost you, I believe, over $3,000 for a full set of the Talmud. Or you can go to Sefaria or download our app and have the same exact text in your pocket or on your laptop. Why would Koren Publishing, that actively sells print publication throughout the world, allow for Sefaria to give it to you for free? And I think the answer to that is that Koren might be a private company that sells publications in print. They also believe, no different than Sefaria, that Torah is not free like beer. They could give you the gift of a Steinsaltz translated Talmud if they wanted to, but they're not going to do that. It's not in their business interest. But that every Jewish person who wants access to the Talmud in translation should have it is also in their business interest, even as it is in our interest to open access outside of needing to pay for it. And that is not necessarily revolutionary in the history of Jewish learning and in the history of the transmission of Torah, but it is revolutionary in the context of American culture and in the context of how we view product and what it means to have open access today. And so we're super excited to have this Talmud, and it's a big deal that you can get this very high quality translation, again, in your hand or on your laptop. When Sefaria started, it was just the Tanakh, originally just the Torah, and then shortly after the entire Tanakh. And then shortly after that, I believe some commentaries on the Tanakh. And it slowly at first and then very quickly exponentially expanded. And we now have hundreds of titles, and I recently learned the exact number of word count that we have in our library, but I don't recall it right now. And some of our texts come from the 21st century, and of course we have our fundamental texts of the Torah, and we have the primary texts of the Jewish canon for all the generations in between. That transmission of Torah, right, this tradition that we have in Jewish thought of having both the written Torah, which we've now digitized, and you can have in non-written form, but readable, and then of course the oral Torah. And the oral Torah came to be written down sometime around the 2nd to 3rd century, according to tradition. But that oral Torah is also more than just the ideas that we wrote down, but the interpretations of them. And so Sefaria also prides itself on being a resource for people to come and share Torah with each other, right? And so I am bringing us into the Mishnah, which is the 2nd, 3rd century compilation of legal material that makes up the foundation of the Jewish oral tradition of the oral Torah. And the Mishnah is broken up into 6 different sections. And if you've had some amount of in-depth Jewish education, you might have heard of the 6 orders of Mishnah. But when you look at the books on a bookshelf, except for the spines and actually seeing and reading the titles, there's not necessarily a way to know how they're organized. And one of the things I love about Sefaria's simple layout is it really does give us a better sense of understanding how these well-known collections of texts like the Talmud, like the Mishnah, actually work internally, how they are actually structured in ways that you don't necessarily get to see it on a bookshelf. And so out of these 6 orders of Mishnah, there are different topics. There's a topic on holidays, which has to do with calendaring. And there's a topic on things having to do with marriage and family purity laws. And there is a section on tort law. There is a section on damages. And one of the most well-known parts of the Mishnah, people don't always think of as part of the Mishnah, and it sits separate from the rest of the Mishnah. And if you didn't see it in this type of arrangement, you might not realize that the collection of wisdom literature known as Pirkei Avot, which is traditionally learned on Shabbat between Passover and Shavuot, and that this is a part of the Mishnah. And not only is it a part of the Mishnah, but it is a part of the Mishnah that deals with tort law and damages. And so why would our tradition include a collection of wisdom literature, ethics, and morals alongside what you do when you have an ox that gores too many of your neighbors, or you have a tree that grows over a property line and the root damages someone else's cistern? Why would our wisdom literature of ethics and morals be alongside our laws on damages? Not a rhetorical question. I'd love to hear some proposals. And how many of you knew that Pirkei Avot?
Well, this isn't an answer, but
okay.
I ask that question almost every day in Daf Yomi. Why is this where it is?
Why is
There's
this
so
here?
much,
Yes.
so many times. Today it was, no, last week it was, why do they discuss what blessings, what legal framings have to be said in Hebrew?
Right.
Which in the middle of Sota.
Yes, no, the
Right?
Talmud
How does
is
that
a
make sense?
Talmud is a
Right?
wonderful stream
So,
of consciousness
I
document.
don't know why Pirkei Avot's there. I would ask David Schwartz and he would tell me, but I'm sure we could make up a million reasons, but I ask that all the time. David, what do you think? You teach Pirkei Avot
I
so
do teach
much.
Pirkei Avot. I was doing a string of it over the first summer of classes every week, and now I just do it once a month. Somewhere I read, based off of some evidence within the Mishnah, that at one point this was the end of the Mishnah. That the Mishnah only had 4 orders. And so they put it at the end as a way of saying, like, yes, all this legal stuff is important, but don't forget the ethical stuff. And then just like the city of Chicago grew so that Western Avenue is no longer the western boundary of the city and North Avenue is no longer the northern boundary of the city, the Mishnah kept going, but the ending got put here, similar to how in Birkat Hamazon, the Uvnei Yerushalayim blessing was the end of Birkat Hamazon at one point, which is why that's the only time that we say Amen Torah and blessing,
right?
To remind us that that was the end of Birkat at one point, and then it kept going.
It definitely goes in line with our tendency to add things to our compilations, but rarely take anything out, which is what makes everything take so long. I don't know if there is a answer or not. I've always found it to be a fascinating exploration of how we see the impact of our moral and ethical lives in the world. So much of Seder Nezikin, so much of the section dealing with damages has to do with what are the unintended consequences of the ramifications of actions and how they affect your neighbors. And I think ethics is a perfect place to understand how do unintended consequences of our actions affect our neighbors. And I am always so deeply moved by the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, perhaps among Torah learners, one of the most well-known sections of the Mishnah. And I am going to read it, just the beginning, in Hebrew, because the translation that we have here is not entirely literal, and I like to read this hyper literally. Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai. Moses received Torah from Sinai. Umesorah leYehoshua, and he imparted it to Yehoshua. V'Yehoshua lizkenim, Yehoshua to the elders, u'zkenim l'nevi'im, the elders to the prophets, u'nevi'im misaruha la'anshe knesset hagedolah, and the prophets imparted it to the people of the great assembly. Now, you might have been reading along in English translation and thought to yourself, Justin, how is what you said any different than what is written there in the English? Now, other than taking away the gendered reading at the end of that sentence, what was different in what I said from what the English says?
Imparted instead of transmitted.
Good. Imparted instead of transmitted.
Also Torah rather than the Torah.
What's the difference between Torah and the Torah?
Torah is a class of information. The Torah is a specific body, as we describe it anyway.
Right. I love that idea of Torah is an idea and the Torah is an object. Right. So if we wanted to learn more about what the intricacies of some of these perhaps more elusive, the elusive meanings of some of these statements might be, how would we find within Jewish learning, how do we find what something like this means? Who do we look to?
You hover over the words and Sefaria tells us.
But before Sefaria existed, right, if you had a question about what a phrase in a traditional text like the Mishnah or the Talmud or the Torah meant, we have generations and generations of commentators that share with us what those traditions throughout oral Torah have been. And so what Sefaria allows for us to do, if you're not familiar with the website, I just clicked on that text. And when I click on that text, it opens up all sorts of additional information from within the library. Connections, just like we saw all of those little lines moving between verses from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, into where they're quoted in the Talmud, we have any time that Pirkei Avot 1:1 appears elsewhere in our library, a link to those texts. And so included in those texts would be the traditional commentaries. And Mishnah has been studied with two traditional commentaries in particular for a very long time now. One is the commentary by Rabbi Ovadia Bartanura, who was a 16th century Italian commentator and Talmudist. And the other is from Maimonides, from Rambam, who wrote it at a very young age and has been published alongside the Mishnah for a very, very long time. Alongside those very famous commentators, our library also includes some of these that I have no idea what they are. Some of them are very well known, some of them are less well known. The titles that we are acquiring are constantly growing. And this one, for example, this Mishnat Eretz Israel is a very new contemporary commentary on the Mishnah, focusing on the plants, animals, and history of the land of Israel. But for those that are in a traditional yeshiva education, this is not a lesser known commentary, but for your average Jew who might not study the Mishnah at all, or even know what the Mishnah is, this is obviously not your most well-known commentary. But just so you can get a sense, sorry, I meant to note, when we have full English translations of sources, it will mention this on the screen with this EN box. That's what that tells you. And so you can read the commentary of this 18th century Ashkenazi rabbi and learn more about what he thinks this Mishnah means. And he mentions in his commentary the midrash that is cited by Rashi in his commentary on the Torah. Now, rather than having to go and find a copy of the Torah and go and find a Chumash with Rashi's commentary, you can see that there's a link here as I scroll over and it becomes live. It says Rashi on Leviticus 25:1. And when I click that, I get that text in my window too. So now I can look in one eye shot at the 3rd century Mishnah, the 18th century commentary on the Mishnah, and Rashi's 11th century commentary on the ancient Torah. So we can read through Rashi's commentary, and I'm just simply bringing this up to show you how far into the library you can go. And so we can look at just Rashi. Oops, that's the wrong button. Sorry. We can look at.
So excuse me, while you're saying the wrong button, that's a good point, because I get lost in Sefaria. How do you bring up certain sections? I don't know. How do they suddenly, I cannot get, for example, so I'm in chapter 1, in the Steinholtz Mishnah, 1. How do you get to the resources? I don't understand.
So if you just click on a text,
just click anywhere in the text.
Anywhere on the text, and then that resource panel opens.
Okay, I see now.
So I will say, like any website, or even, you go into a store, I'm always really I kind of give a laugh to myself whenever I walk into a big box store anywhere in the country, because they're all exactly the same, right? But if you shop at Lowe's and you go into a Home Depot, you don't know where anything is. Right. And so I feel like Sefaria is no different than any other place that we go to. You just kind of have to learn the ins and outs of that particular place.
Is there a way to drop breadcrumbs so you can get back to where you were or something?
I'm going to leave some time at the end for these kinds of questions. So I'm going to put that in a little parking lot. And but thank you, Len, for the question, and I will reach back to it. So when you are able to have this kind of side-by-side textual learning, it's really not very different than when you learn with a Mikraot Gedolot, which is the traditional collection of the Torah and all of the traditional commentaries that we're used to seeing alongside it. But what Sefaria allows for us to do here is, again, expand more into the different places that these texts appear. Why is Rashi the commentator that we always go to first? Does anyone know why Rashi is the one that we always go to first? Is his commentary better than everybody else's, more understandable, something like that?
Isn't that me, Sinai?
That Rashi is the one that you go to?
Yeah.
For those that might not understand, the joke that Cindy is making is that it's as if Moses commanded us when the Torah was given, you must read this with the 11th century rabbi who wrote on the border of France and Germany. Anyone know why Rashi is the one?
And has his own text.
I'm sorry?
And has his own text.
What do you mean he has his own text?
Rashi text.
Good. So
Script.
Rashi actually never would have seen Rashi's script, but rather Rashi was printed in that script because it became so common to print Rashi next to the Torah that there needed to be a way to tell the difference. The reason that Rashi is such an influential commentator is because he never actually shares with you his own ideas. Rashi is always quoting Midrash. He is picking a particular Midrashic read to interpret the verse, but he's always quoting Midrash. So here in that commentary on Pirkei Avot 1:1 about the transmission of Torah, that commentator brought us to this idea of when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, and that in the book of Leviticus, after the story of Mount Sinai is already complete, we have a verse that says that God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and then gives the laws of Shemitah, the year of agricultural and economic remission that happens once every 7 years. And in Rashi's commentary, he explains that the reason the Torah uses the term Sinai in the book of Leviticus is to let you know that even though this didn't appear in the story of the revolution of the Torah in the book of Exodus, that God gave these laws to Moses on Mount Sinai also. Again, Rashi didn't come up with this idea. This is an idea from very, very early rabbinic midrash called Sifra, where we can see when we open up that midrash alongside the Torah, alongside Rashi, exactly where Rashi got his idea from. This is, again, not new. Is this the first time that people can learn that Rashi is quoting Sifra? No, absolutely not. But is this the first time that someone who has no idea who Rashi is and has no idea what Sifra is and might not even know what Leviticus is? Yeah, it is. And not only can someone do that, but they can do it with the guidance of all of these translations and community translations and published translations. So you're engaged in this learning in advance of Shavuot, and Shavuot is very, very close. What is it that we are celebrating at Shavuot?
Giving of Torah.
The giving of the Torah, that same transmission that Pirkei Avot symbolizes by imparting or transmitting from generation to generation. And the implication of that being that it does not end. That transmission of Torah, that revelation of Torah is passed down generation to generation. We come back to Mount Sinai every single year to figuratively receive the Torah again. And throughout the history of human writing and publishing, the words of the 10 Commandments, which are read at Shavuot in synagogues throughout the world, are perhaps the most read, published, translated, and written about words in all of human history. I'm scrolling down through the book of Exodus to look at the story for a minute of the giving of the Torah, which is such this dramatic moment where people see thunder and they can hear lightning, and a shofar that is supposed to be loud at first and quiet at the end is quiet at first and loud at the end, and everything is kind of backwards, and God is on earth and Moses might be in heaven, and it's this very intense, wonderful story. And we know, the rabbis have this midrash that when God spoke at Mount Sinai and the entire Jewish people heard it, it instantly split out into 70 distinct languages. the idea of translation and interpretation to understand Torah has been a part of our tradition forever. We even imagine God as a translator of Torah. And you can find new translations being made constantly. The translation here that we're looking at was published in 2006 by the Jewish Publication Society. Very similar to their previous translations, but God is no longer gendered, and they've removed the word the Lord and replaced it with the Tetragrammaton, with Yud He Vav He. So I can look at the JPS translation, and I know when I first started studying Torah on a more in-depth level, when I was 18, I can remember sitting in Jerusalem in a study hall, and the teacher would bring out as many translations of the Torah as we could find in the building, and we would look at one verse and all of the translations, and it would be amazing how different they could be. And so we can look at translations. I'm actually going to open up a side-by-side window. You can see in the resource panel, you can compare texts to each other. And you can look at different texts, or you can even look at the same text. So I'm just opening up Exodus chapter 19, verse 16. And right now we have the same translation side by side. But I can change my translation. I have 20 translations to choose from. I'm actually going to go down and go to the original JPS translation from 1917. And let's see if there are ways that JPS has changed how they translated their own text. And it looks like they are more or less the same, but they updated it for syntax and a couple of word choices that might not be in fashion anymore as they were over 100 years ago. Or we can look at a radically different translation from the JPS translation, my personal favorite, Everett Fox's translation, Shocking Bible. The value of having all of these translations side by side brings us into that same transmission of Torah from Moses to Joshua, to the elders, to the prophets, to the people of the Great Assembly, through the generations of rabbis, and into our homes and synagogues and schools today. One of my teachers, Rabbi Mimi Feigelson, likes to say, if you meet a Jew who reads a verse completely opposite from how you do, you stood on the other side of Mount Sinai from that person, but you both stood there together. And so one of the incredible things that Sefaria allows for us to do is to have this comparison and contrasts of all these different translations. Not sure what happened there. To have these different comparisons so that not that we can come to a conclusion of what is right and what is wrong, but so that we can continue that dialogue that our people have been engaged in for so long. I've spoken a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I just want to show you a couple more of our, what I think, really interesting resources alongside these kinds of multiple translations. Let's look just really quickly at some of the 10 Commandments themselves, just because we're all going to be looking at them together when we come and to synagogue on Shavuot to hear them read. And, you know, this word is always, especially in American context, avadim, servants or slaves, serfs. You have translated here. Sorry, the page jumped a bit when I opened the box. So what's the difference between a serf and a slave? What's the difference between a servant and a serf? And what does this word actually mean in Hebrew? So I guess I picked a bad example. When you double click, let's look at the word for Egypt, Mitzrayim. When you double click on most words in, this is still a relatively new feature that we have. When you double click on a word, it automatically brings you to dictionary entries. So you don't even have to be a Hebrew speaker to be able to begin to explore the etymology of Hebrew words and to be able to begin to learn more deeply how Hebrew works as a language through using these dictionaries that most people wouldn't have on their bookshelves at home unless you are a scholar of Torah or an academic. And so we have access now to the Brown Driver Briggs dictionary, which has been the go-to dictionary for biblical Hebrew for many, many, many generations now. And that type of resource is just really the beginning. Perhaps more useful to your average reader is going to be maybe you want to know how the 10 Commandments are spoken about in articles on the internet. And so we have a list of websites that are connected to our library, everything from blog posts from Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory to My Jewish Learning. If you want an Orthodox perspective, from the Jewniversity, from Aish Torah, from the entire large tent of the Jewish people. You can find major universities, rabbinical schools, just regular folks who are writing their own personal blogs, incredible resources, thousands of pages throughout the internet, immediately clickable right from our library. You can find out what many people have said off of our website. Inside of our website, Sefaria has always been geared towards allowing for Jews to share amongst ourselves. And one of the ways that we do that is through the ability to build and share source sheets. Your own education director, David, is an incredibly prolific builder of source sheets. And it doesn't take long to find some of his work when you scroll through here. Oh, I thought that it was right there. There it is. David created a study guide on Jewish values and how they relate during the American Revolution, and has looked at materials in the Torah and commentaries and all of these different things. A really wonderful lesson. That's just one example of the many things that David has put out for anyone who comes across Sefaria to find. And so right now, there's a lot of people who come to Sefaria specifically looking for information about the book of Ruth, because they know they're going to be studying Ruth for Shavuot, because that's the Megillah that we read for that pilgrimage festival. And so just like I was playing through the library and looking at commentators and looking at all of the connections, I can do the same thing from David's source sheet, explaining the 4 different parts of the book of Ruth. I can open up his connection here from the book of Ruth and find all of the different places that Ruth might appear. So if we want to learn more about Ruth separate from David's source sheet, we can go explore into the library, or just like we were doing before, I'm just picking a random commentary here. It's not going to be in English. We can look at the commentary alongside what David has put together. And all of David's collections can be found in, like, he has this massive collection of sheets on holidays, or if you just click on his username, you can find, looks like my internet is slowing down. Here we go. You can find all of his collections and resources that he has shared with the entirety of the usership that comes Sefaria's way. Again, I apologize for going a little bit over what I had wanted. There were a couple of more things that I wanted to show you, but I do want to save time for some questions. Really quick, just to give you, again, a basic overview. Everything that you find in Sefaria is completely free to all users, and not just free in that it won't cost you anything, free in that it is your inherent birthright as a member of the Jewish people. And it is your inherent birthright as a member of human society to benefit also from the Jewish wisdom of our ancestral textual tradition. And Sefaria is really here to make sure that you have access to as much of this material as you possibly can. And we try and do so in as inviting and accommodating and opening and non-judgmental as a way. You will not find interpretations from us. You will simply find access. And again, I apologize for going a little over, but if you are willing to give a few more minutes of your time, I'd love to field a couple of your questions.
What's coming?
Len, I do remember your parking lot question, so I will talk a little bit more about that.
What other texts are coming? Do you know?
I do know. I can't speak to you about what texts are coming, but I can tell you we have recently put out some really exciting material. We are in the middle of expanding our Chabad library, and Chabad is actually playing along with us very, very nicely. And so we have materials written, early material from the Alter Rebbe, from the first Rebbe of Chabad, Reb Schneur Zalman of Liadi, some of his original writings, as well as Tanya, his seminal work, the core theological piece of Chabad, in full translation. We have some incredible Kabbalistic texts that have recently been put on the library, some in translation. We are still working on trying to get a full translation in English of the Zohar, but it's a little hard to get in with all of the footnotes that go along with it. In general, we are always looking for ways to expand our library. At this point, if there is a fundamental text that you look in our library and you're like, how is it that you don't have this? It's because we can't. We have exhausted all of our connections with publishers for the text that we're able to get, and now we are in negotiation with publishers for the text that they don't want us to have. And when I tell you that we are committed to doing this, it is the amount of resources that our donors and foundations that support us are willing to invest in ensuring Torah as open access to all is really, it's just inspiring. We have Everett Fox's translation of the minor prophets, or of the early prophets, sorry, and some new stuff coming out constantly.
Justin, do you have part of your website? If I wanted to chant Torah or Haftorah, if I wanted to do it for one of the, like Purim or, I mean, that there are all these different chants for different holidays.
Yeah, we do now. It's actually it's a relatively new feature, but in the Torah, I don't believe we have it for the Megillah or anything like that. But for Haftorah, but for the Torah, we do have audio recording of verse by verse, cantilated in the Ashkenazi tradition.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just the Shabbat Nusach. Just the normal trope.
Just the typical. Correct.
Yeah. Is that what you meant, Mike?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms, Len, of your question around how do you find things? And is there a way to trace back?
Yeah.
Right. And keep what I think you use breadcrumbs to follow your trail.
Right.
If you have a registered account, which is of course free, and is as simple as putting your email address into our login, then yes, you can. Not only will it trace your steps, but it will log how much you look at each part of our library. You can bookmark texts that you want to save for yourself and keep a notebook for yourself. In addition to keeping your own curated materials from the library, you can make your own source sheets, just like David has in his collections, and you can share those publicly or keep them privately. And you can have your settings to whether you want to see Hebrew or English or both, and what translations you like. And so I would strongly recommend, even if you only use it once a year, getting an account with Sefaria opens up those tools and resources, all of which are available to you without the account, but they don't work together in the same way. And so having that log for yourself, if it's something that you go back to and you want to know. And so if you have the app on your phone, it will start from the same text that you closed it with. You can download the entire library. It takes less than a minute, and the entire library is in your pocket. It works great on tablets. It works great on phones. And we are constantly working to make it better. And I will say that we take feedback from our regular users most. We prioritize those feedback calls most of all. And like if I make a feedback request, they don't listen to me at all. But if you all make feedback requests, we really do our best to accommodate, because we want our users to feel at home, and it can be intimidating, especially when you begin. And that also is Torah, right? Think about the story that we read at Shavuot of the people standing around the mountain and falling back out of disbelief of what it is that they're witnessing, according to some traditions, literally dying for a moment. And that I can remember, that's how I felt the first time I saw Sefaria, was like, I can't breathe. I'm so excited. And as much as I work for a website and I am among Sefaria's biggest cheerleaders, technology terrifies me. The idea of what happens to our ancient tradition in these new hands of technology is very scary. And so I fully believe, just like that moment that we celebrate at Shavuot, we stand around the mountain together to support ourselves to receive and accept Torah, that when we engage in this and that democratic access where we all, it doesn't matter if you have a lifetime of learning behind you or you are just starting to explore what this text is and what all of these texts are together, we need one another's openness and insights in order to keep this alive generation to generation, so that the next generation's elders can give it to the next generation's prophets, and so on and so forth. And so I just want to wish you all an early happy Shavuot, and thank you for being interested in what we have, and I hope that you continue to enjoy it, and as they say, to turn it and to grow old and gray with it. And really just excited that you all are excited enough to learn more.